TUPE is really important and complex, impacting every corporate acquisition and outsourcing. Jane Fielding is going to tell us about the new changes in TUPE. Jane, we've had TUPE for 10 years now. What's the big deal?
Well, the big deal is that it's sometimes hard to spot whether it applies. Sometimes it's very obvious, but it can apply in such a wide range of circumstances that sometimes it can be difficult to decide at the outset whether it does apply or not. But getting it wrong can carry some very hefty liabilities in terms of claims from employees for information and consultation obligations. You have to talk to people about what's happening to them, and also you can inherit a workforce that you may not be expecting if you weren't expecting TUPE to apply, and you inherit them with all their claims and rights that go along with their employment contract. So it's quite a big downside if you don't spot that it's coming, and it does.
Does TUPE apply to offshore outsourcing?
Well, interestingly, that's been a subject of debate for quite a long time, actually, even before we had the 2006 regulations. And most commentators, including ourselves, thought that it would apply to an offshoring because there's nothing in the wording that says it doesn't. It talks about where the undertaking or the services are provided in Great Britain before the transfer. And we've now got a case which indicates that actually that is the correct view, although that case didn't actually have to find that to get to the result. So it's obiter, but it is supportive of that view, definitely.
Is there a consultation requirement?
Well, the consultation requirements are, again, meant as an employment protection mechanism. TUPE stands for the Transfer of Undertakings Protection of Employment Regulations, and that's a key thing to bear in mind whenever you're looking at a TUPE-type scenario. So the idea is that you have to consult long enough before the transfer takes place with representatives of the employees, either unions or specially elected employee representatives, so that the employees understand what's going to change after the transfer. The technical word is measures. You consult about measures, but it's basically, again, a very broad concept about anything that's going to be different for the employees after the transfer.
There's consultation, but there's also the provision of information.
That's right. There are actually two obligations to provide information. One is information that has to go to the employee reps, and that's about the fact of the transfer and certain other information that they have to have about the consequences of the transfer for the employees affected. And then there's a second type of information obligation which has to go from the transferor, the outgoing employer, to the incoming employer, the transferee, and that's meant to help the transferee gauge what sort of workforce it's inheriting. But that information is quite limited, so in a lot of cases it's not actually that useful, and it's a case of too little really and a bit too late. It doesn't have to be supplied until 14 days before the transfer, and in a lot of transactions that's way too late to gauge how the liabilities are going to affect price and whether you actually want to do the deal at all.
When do you need to start thinking about TUPE?
Well, our advice would be that you should start thinking about it at the absolute initial planning stages, because at that stage you've got the opportunity to factor into the timetable any information and consultation that you need to do. You can decide whether you think TUPE applies or not, and then you can build it into the whole transaction timetable, and the risks that are going to apply in the particular transaction can be taken into account in the negotiations from the start. So I think our advice would be it's never too soon to be engaging in a bit of TUPE spotting.
Jane, if I was an in-house lawyer faced with a TUPE transaction, what are your top tips?
Well, the first thing is to know that you're faced with it. So top tip number one is think about it at the start of a transaction. It can apply in so many scenarios. Just check right at the start whether you think you're in that scenario or not. If you are, then you need to factor into the timetable the length of the consultation and information exercise that you think you're going to have to embark on, because that can affect the overall timetable in some cases, if you've got very significant changes that the incoming employer wants to make. Don't assume just because it's an offshoring that TUPE doesn't apply. You need to, again, go through the same analysis. And in terms of avoiding liabilities, then again you need a very thorough due diligence process to understand what liabilities you're facing, because this concept of information sharing between transferor and transferee really isn't going to be enough. You're going to have to stick to your traditional due diligence early on in the transaction, I'm afraid.